So I've been trying to get my head into stem cell technologies because I'm trying to save my wife's life. She has ALS, which is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, otherwise known as Lou Gehrig's disease or motor neuron disease, which means that over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, she is going to be losing all functionality of her body, meaning all muscles are just going to deteriorate, and she will be trapped inside of her body with an absolutely fresh, brilliant, on-the-spot brain and mind. She'll be able to see things, but she won't be able to talk. She won't be able to do a bunch of things like swallow or, breathe. It's the worst disease that currently exists in our society, in America, and I would say maybe the whole world. So I need your help because I can't afford this. There's some stuff happening in America that I'm going to talk a little bit about, actually, that has prevented our country from being able to keep up with the miraculous stem cell technologies that other countries are developing, that we actually helped get started. All right, I need to calm down and lay this story out. Okay, but first, please, if you can, please donate to our fund. I'm going to put the address up on the screen here. I'm not trying to become a YouTuber here. This isn't I'm not asking you to subscribe to my video and hit the bell icon. We need help. This is what I'm doing these videos for. Is I'm trying to get the word out that there's something's going on here, folks, and we need to do something about it. And it's affecting me to my core. It's become my entire life, unfortunately. So I want to talk about it because I need to let out some steam. The problem with this disease is once you get it, my wife has it, but I have it. As far as I'm concerned, we both have this thing, and it just consumes you, and it takes over everything in your soul. And I'm sure other incurable diseases do the same thing to people as well. But this was, I was not prepared for this. What song is that? Anyone? If you can name that tune, I will say, hey, good job, man. Okay, the technology that we're pursuing here in the US is this neuron therapy that the company Brainstorm Cell Therapeutics, along with about a $16 million grant from the California Regenerative Medicine Institute, is right now in the final throes of getting FDA approval so that they can market, set up licensing agreements and, register, do their thing, but at this rate, the treatment that my wife needs today will not be available until 2021 at the earliest, unless, of course, something changes, and changes quick, right? What do they call it? It's the Deus Ex Machina, right? Where some deity comes in at the end and throws the lightning bolts and fixes the whole show, right? And at this point, can't believe I'm saying this, the Deus Ex Machina that we're hoping for is the White House is going to take action and put in an executive order that demands that the FDA at the very least, create either a non-binding or a third-party analysis agreement with this company. Anyway, okay, so let me get back to what I'm talking about. Because even when this neuron does get approved, there is a chance that insurance companies are going to balk at footing the bill for ALS patients because it, first of all, would be the first stem cell therapy in mass use in America, which means there are a lot of X factors that are unforeseen, and insurance companies will use anything as a way to crawl out of pain. Now, I know it'll be classified as a life-saving treatment, and it'll probably be upheld in a court of law if anyone can afford to, take insurance companies to courts for something like this. But it's not unheard of for insurance companies, especially those facing, new, expensive FDA-approved treatments, to accept the treatments, but with provisions that require the beneficiary to fall within the same inclusion or exclusion criterion of the clinical trial. So, for example, one of the requirements for the clinical trial is that a patient has to be under 60 years old. So it's possible, though hopefully unlikely, that insurance companies will then say, okay, anyone older cannot receive the treatment because they don't know if the efficacy of the treatment will have an effect on folks that were outside of the parameters of the clinical trial. I know this sounds ridiculous, sounds like the plot of a movie. It has happened in the past, though. This has happened. You really think that in a society that values money over life, that this sort of thing wouldn't happen? Too far-fetched? Let's look again, my friends. So that's what I've been thinking a lot about. What exactly is stem cell technology? Is it going to be as important to all living creatures as things like the internet has been? Will it be the catalytic technology that finally activates this ability for us to become immortal? Because honestly, that's what I think it is. And I think that's what's at stake. That's why the religious zealots of all faiths and cultures are so adamantly clamoring against the use of these technologies. The sanctity of life argument, that's what they call it, But what does that mean? What does that mean to you? What's the sanctity of life? We often use words correctly in context, even though most people wouldn't be able to actually know what the actual meaning of the word is, right? They infer meaning, in their mind, but not necessarily have a correct understanding what the word means. Like the word sentience, for example. Ask yourself, okay, right now, ask yourself, have you heard of the word sentience? All right, here's the next one. Do you have an understanding of what it means? Okay, now could you use it in a sentence? Probably, right? For most of us, we've probably come across that word, probably in some sci-fi movie or something like that, and probably used the word sentience as a synonym for consciousness or like intelligent life or something like that, right? But that's not what sentience means. In fact, in some ways, it's the polar opposite of what most people think the word sentience means. Sentience is the ability to feel, feel, touch, pain. Not emotional concept of feelings like love, and I mean things like tickling and a soothing rub, schmack across the punum. So, sanctity means what? It means to be holy or sacred, right? It means to be inviolable. Oh, inviolable. Inviolable means, what does inviolable mean? It means it can't be broken, it can't be challenged, but it comes from the realm of religion. Okay, it's a God thing. It's a position that is taken by people that believe that life is bestowed by a creator, and as such, ne'er a man alive will, be allowed to fondle that or try to influence it, because doing so would mean that humans and God can be on a level playing field, and that would render the holiness of the divine as nothing more than a parlor trick. So no, we must hold all God's creations under our protection. And what's interesting is that the Western churches apply this sanctity of life concept solely to humans. Why is that? It's referred to in sociology as dominionism. Hello, dominionism. I like the word. I like dominion. It's beautiful. But how does that work again? Dominionism? So are dogs or llamas not God's creatures? Are they not alive? Okay, so let's not worry about that right now. But what about, let's just accept that for some reason, the dogma of the primary religions of the world place humans as more holy or more sacred than whales or bacteria. Okay, what about contraception then? Because it seems like most religions are pretty coolio with contraceptive practices, but isn't the use of contraception interfering with God's plan? The majority of people who believe in God consider themselves righteous, but modernly righteous. Not, really church-going, but devout in the same sense that you really believe in God. But also sort of on the science side too. In fact, secretly, you probably know that there's something not quite right about how the big religions work, and science. It can be proven. But you still have a soft spot for your childhood, which is when you had most of your religious upbringing. So you're not quite ready to, chuck it all. Or you genuinely believe that there is a creator and that it is watching or monitoring our choices, but you're not going to pray for God to heal your broken leg. You're going to take that thing to the hospital and let technologies and doctors make it all good. That's who we are. And 70% of us or so who believe in God also understand that there's a difference between a ball of cells and a fetus. So we're more than fine with embryonic stem cell research and therapies because no life is being destroyed. No life is being destroyed in that process. Okay? I'm getting ahead of myself. So, sanctity isn't really what I wanted to focus on in this recording. I'm more interested in hashing out that life part of the sanctity of life phrase. So I think that any reasonable person would agree that even though there is a continuum, if you will, when it comes to questions like when does life begin or end, or that there is no beginning or end, just a continuum of varying states, we have to all decide what the criterion is for defining both life and the more sacred thing we call human life. Because life itself is a pretty basic thing. Bacteria are alive. That dandelion at the end of that grassy driveway is alive. But we're not really talking about that kind of life when we make arguments about the sanctity of life. Shoot, as I mentioned earlier, we're not even talking about dogs and dolphin life, which is pretty complex. And it's filled with all sorts of emotions, you got pets, I'm sure, But that argument, the argument about the sanctity of life, is really about people. But let's explore that idea for a second, shall we? People. So a person is what? How do you define personhood? Is it simply being animate? No. It's definitely more than being animate, able to move. What about breathing? Well, monkeys can breathe, but we wouldn't attribute personhood to them, right? Or would we? Now, I would, but I'm speaking rhetorically here. I'm trying to represent the position of what I call religious zealotry. So, no, monkeys, they don't qualify, okay? So, how about a thing with the brain? Can't do that? I don't like, because, fruit flies have brains. So, no. When you really press someone that makes that sanctity of life argument, you and they very quickly will come to notice that they really haven't parsed out the positions, much less than the definitions of the terms they're using. Ultimately, the realization comes when you engage this thought line just a bit further, that since we're made of smaller parts like arms and blood cells and atoms and molecules, we can't say that the biological frame that houses our personhood is the same thing as our personhood, right? I mean, you wouldn't say your bedroom is your house, would you? It's part of it. But if it was gone, so, okay, imagine alien life descends onto your neighborhood and for some reason uses their advanced weaponry to just wipe out just your bedroom, nothing else, all right? So everything else is fine, but where your bedroom was, bye-bye, she's gone. A little smoldering stream of smoke twisting into the sky. Did you lose your house? No. House is still there. Or God forbid, you go to fight in a war to ensure the rich remain the rich and you lose your legs in a blast. So are you no longer a person? Of course you are. The leg is not the person. It's the narrative that's produced by that body-mind combination. That's what defines personhood, at least for me. We're in a constant state of physical renewal, from our skin shedding to growing wisdom teeth, all sorts of metamorphoses we're undergoing right from the get-go. So the body is this self-renewing husk, and it's used to incubate what we call mind, which then becomes actually the thing we call people. Their ability to reason, to create language, to create art, their morality, their inner consciousness, all of which I just kind of bundle it all up into this term I call the narrative. Some people call it the soul, the story. That's what we refer to life in this sense. That's what's holy. That's what we have to hold hallowed. It's sacrosanct. I love that word. Not the cells in our bodies, not the molecules and the atoms and the quarks. I mean, 2 or 3 years ago, some guy at the Max Planck Institute in Germany created a cell with the necessary machinery for it to divide on its own. Okay? We put that together with just 2 proteins, a couple of fat molecules, and some chemical energy. That's not some holy divine power, folks. These scientists are not... it's an organic machine. It's a cell. It's not a baby. It's not a fetus. There's no head. There's no brain. There aren't organs. There's no skin. But, like I was saying, there's got to be some point in the evolutionary process where we go from ingredients for life to the holy, sacred thing, the human life. All right. So when exactly is that? So I'll submit some of my thoughts on that tip shortly, but maybe I think it'll help me to just kind of recap. The sanctity of life is too broad a statement to make. Life happens in a lot of ways. Single-celled organisms to senators, to goldfish, to a lemon tree in your backyard, to protozoa that swims into the belly of a whale. That's all life. And no one in their right mind is going to defend the sanctity of lemons, or senators for that matter. Zingo! That stance should really be more about the sanctity of personhood. And personhood can only exist in a living human being. A living human being. A term like sanctity of life is a culture war slogan. Most major religion, the members of the club, they haven't really given it nearly the reflection that it needs, because if they did, they would probably come to the same conclusions. But questioning moral convictions is not something that people want to do. But that's exactly what sanctity of life is, right? It's a moral conviction. It's something some people believe in. It's not a principle of physics or chemistry or, anything objective. It's about ideology. And if you know me, you know how I feel about ideology and culture, a bit more controversially, right? I am not a fan. And to be clear, I am not saying I'm not a fan of your culture, your ideology. I'm talking about the concepts themselves. And I'm not speaking about heritage either. Culture is not heritage. Culture... Okay, heritage is perhaps based on culture, but not the other way around. Culture is just like a big arrow that goes, go that way, hey, Terrence. Now, if culture was something that we as individuals created without the influence of television or books or magazines or NPR or Terrence McKenna or, any of these philosophers, whoever you're into, if you create your own roadshow, hey, I'm down with culture, but that's not exactly how people work, right? Buckminster Fuller, read this cat. Culture is not your friend. It's the friend of churches. It's the friend of institutions. I mean, just look at our own culture. In Western modern culture, we fetishize things, right? Like objects. We create consumer mania. We preach forms of false happiness. This guy I mentioned a couple times, Terrence McKenna, was person I read a lot when I was in college. A modern American philosopher died, interestingly, of a brain tumor, a brain thing. He was a controversial cat as well because, there's some parts of his work that a lot of folks are, not a lot, some people just don't get, really. That's really what is up. They don't get it. You may have heard of him, though, through Joe Rogan, because he's a huge fan of Terence McKenna, which is awesome. It's awesome. And he's also a fan of his brother, Dennis McKenna, who's also another genius. But he was the scientist of the two brothers, where Terence was the gadfly, and Dennis was the actual botanist. And so he didn't get his just desserts. But, of course, now that, that Terence died like 20 years ago. Oh, no, was it 20 years ago? I don't know. 10 years ago. His brother is coming up, and it's because of Joe Rogan, and of course, Joe Rogan rocks. He's a good guy. A little weird, but mostly a good guy. Anyway, so McKenna, he said, what culture does is that it invites people to diminish themselves as individuals and dehumanizes us by making us behave like a hive, like we're machines. Our culture is everything that we do, from how we value lives to what we determine as important. And here in the US, it's based almost entirely on wealth, money. For example, I bet everyone watching this knows who Bill Gates is, or Steve Jobs, or Jeff Bezos, probably less likely on that side, even though he's the richest. But how many of us could say anything of significance about the minds of modern time philosophers like Buckminster Fuller, like Terence McKenna, Descartes, Marx, Kant, Noam Chomsky, Jung? Carl Jung doesn't get what he deserves, man. Yeah, he improved. He moved psychology a little bit, nowhere near as much as Sigmund did, but what Jung did for psychology is huge. It's huge. Anyway, all of these brilliant thinkers, right? Who can tell? What did Alexander Hamilton do, for example? Well, that's not a good example because the musical. Now everybody knows who Alexander Hamilton is. Even the kids. I got middle school kids that love Alexander Hamilton, the Hamilton musical, which is fantastic. Anyway, Marshall McLuhan, Jean-Paul Sartre, Alfred North Whitehead, Wittgenstein, these are great minds of our time, the purveyors of humankind. Steve Jobs convinced his chubby friend to pretend that they both came up with a brilliant concept and then bought a suit to talk about his friend's idea. If you can even really call him his friend, frankly. But he is the one that's venerated as a symbol of innovation and advanced technology, sort of like basically the messiah of the consumer internet age. Why? Because that's what our combined culture values. New, shiny, cool. Necessary? Maybe. And there's also that the sanctity of life concept is a religious one. Now, okay, I'll be clear. I am not a religious person, but I acquiesce the idea of intelligent design or creator, or at the very least an older being, even within our universe that maybe spawned life. So I'm not an anti-God person. I think much of the philosophy that can be discerned from the stories and parables from our past are beautiful lessons. Lessons that should be discussed, remembered, in some cases revered. But I am an American. And in America, we don't make policy based on the notions of a religion. Because, note, not all Abrahamic religions even agree on this stuff. So for example, Christians defend the position, I'm generalizing, not all Christians, but most Christians will defend the idea that life begins at the zygotic level, the zygote, right? But Muslims have an ensoulment idea, ensoulment. This is an idea where they say that there is a moment when the biophysical part of us gains the soul. And they actually say it happens on the 42nd day after the zygote, after the haploids, the sperm and the egg, fuse. And then the egg shuts out all other sperm. And that's also what the Greeks thought too. Aristotle said that it took male embryos 40 days to be unsold, and female embryos, it took them 90 days. So even back then, man, damn, women have just been, it's not right, dude. Why would it take women 90 days? Maybe it was a compliment. Maybe they were saying that the soul of the woman is twice as rich as the soul of the man. You think that's what was going on? Jews say that people are thinking even before they're born. We're all over the place as far as what even the religions believe to be true. But more fundamentally, this whole idea presumes that life is a gift from something. We can talk ontology and bioethics and beliefs this and social construct that, and the bottom line is that none of that really matters. Not one bit to a dying man who built a life, a family, had dreams, sacrificed, created dreams, inspired others, raised children, but now is having to endure not only the experience of his own body involuntarily and over a few short years, suffocating him, paralyzing him to a point where he can't swallow, he can't move, he can't scratch an itch on his thigh because he can't move his body. Or the child with leukemia, or the mother with Parkinson's, or your sister with Alzheimer's. This is tragedy, folks. This is devastating diseases. They eat you alive, and then they eat your family alive, because these things affect the sick and forever alter those that give care to the sick. Fine. In the care of ALS, you have to basically become your patient with ALS. You have to know their thoughts, their desires, their needs, their fears, the whole thing, man. Because when it gets bad, you become their body. You have to become their voice, even though there is barely an utterance that can be mustered. They say it's much easier when you're a family member, especially if you're a close one. But yeah, not sure that's the case, because even though non-family caregivers get deeply connected with their patients, the family member has that emotional history and that bond that makes it much harder to get through the days when you're constantly up and down with your anxiety and your fear and your love and your joy. It's tough. So here's my thing. I think the 14-day rule makes the most amount of sense for all sides of this argument, because we can't let this sort of thing happen to America again, all right? All right? We're at least 5 to 10 years behind other industrial countries on stem cell regenerative therapies, and it's because of, and you know, everybody does stuff that doesn't make sense. The left has done dumb things, but in this case, it's about the right-wing religious zealots. Okay, so, and you know, I'm just gonna say this is what happened. Okay, these are facts, and I believe that they are undisputed. Okay, so first, early 1950s, there were some scientists that showed that mice can survive irradiation if you took their spleens and you shielded them with bone marrow infusions. Okay, this was never seen before. Okay, but there it is. Okay, so they thought that maybe bone marrow cells could basically reconstitute messed up systems. So the next 2 decades are spent on all sorts of cool new stuff, like technologies, ways to transplant marrow, and ways to prove that stem cells renew and differentiate, and that kind of stuff. So, oh, somebody's calling. Okay, so then came the 70s, and that's 73, Roe versus Wade. Sure, everybody's probably heard that term before. legalized the termination of pregnancies in the U.S. Okay, and then 5 years later, the first successful human in vitro fertilization took place, and it was called the test tube baby. Because they basically they conceived the zygote in a petri dish. So it really shouldn't have been a test tube. It should have been a petri dish, maybe, because that's actually when it happened. But anyway, then after they created the zygote outside of the body of a woman, it was transferred to a womb, and Louise Brown was born. Bing it, Google it. It's a real live woman, the English woman. But those two things, Roe v. Wade, wow, that's a tough thing to say, and the first in vitro fertilization caused this uproar in religious communities, basically across the whole country. And then that trickled up to the federal government, eventually creating regulations and barring the use of federal funds for research that experimented on specifically human embryos. But then in 1995, there was a research panel that basically went to Clinton, then President Bill Clinton, and said, okay, no, we should be funding federal research on embryo. We should be using federal funds to be researching this. We're crazy. The other industrial countries are doing it. And they said that, look, the way we'll do it is we'll do research on embryos that were left over from in vitro fertility treatments. But this panel also recommended that federal funding on research on embryos that were specifically created for experimentation also be approved. But, Clinton only accepted half of that recommendation. And they said, moral stuff, ethical concerns here, so they said you can do the leftover embryo thing, but not the funding for the creation of embryos specifically for experimentation. Okay, all right. So then Congress catches up. What's happening here? So they intervened and they passed a bill which basically prohibited any federal funding for the Department of Health and Human Services to use it for research that results in the destruction of any embryo, period. Whether it's already, anyway, I get upset. So, meanwhile, South Korea, Panama, Mexico, China, they're straight up gangster chugging forward and saying, sure, go ahead. If it'll save a life or two, it's worth it. In the States, private sector recognized that there was basically no way the religious puritanical roots of our country were going to be overcome as quickly as they needed it to be in order for them to be able to keep up with the Joneses on this kind of technology, because it's expensive, all right? It needs to be done by the state. It's as big as the internet, folks. It's as big as penicillin. It's going to change who we are fundamentally for the better. And something as volatile and precious as our own evolutionary well-being shouldn't be left up to the whims and ways of imaginary invisible hands that are going to guide the market to fund this kind of stuff. The initial cost is off the charts, but the payoff is worth it. Okay, anyway. So 98 comes around and privately funded research starts to go, okay, let's do this. Let's check this out. And they actually come up with some pretty interesting breakthroughs in human embryonic stem cells because, remember, what was banned was federal funding. Private organizations could do whatever they wanted to, all right? So anyway, when the private industry started coming up through some of these breakthroughs, it prompted the Clinton administration to say, okay, wait a second, we need to re-examine some of these guidelines for federal funding of embryonic research. So they changed their minds and they went back to their original stance of funding embryonic stem cell research as long as the embryos weren't created strictly for research. But something pretty major happened in 2000. Anybody remember? Yes, out goes Mr. Clinton, in comes, basically the religious right. They took over American politics, and the newly elected president, Bush, He made it basically so the funding would be provided for stem cell research, but only on the existing stem lines that were already cultured during the previous few years. So no new lines. You can't. They wouldn't allow. The law said you can't create new stuff. Only what you've already built. You can work on that. Once it's gone, it's gone. Finito. Essentially, they shut down government funding for pluripotent stem cell research. And that's how it stayed throughout the 2 terms of this guy's presidency. No government funding for stem cell research. And folks, this stuff costs billions, not millions, billions. For example, you think we would have had the internet if it wasn't for government funding? Do you think global positioning satellites, nav systems in your cars would have been developed by private industry if the government didn't fund it? Do you think private industry would have popped up GPS satellites, to see whether or not people will dig this navigation thing? Do you know the financial risk a private company would need to be able to withstand to be able to make a move like that? It doesn't happen. Okay? Capitalism works until, it doesn't. Then, okay. So finally, country gets back to its senses, elects a president, this guy, Barack Obama, in 2009 issues an executive order called Removing Barriers. What was it? Removing Barriers for Responsible Scientific Research. But throughout all those years, private funding, embryonic research, totally legal. So why didn't the market then make up for that lack of that socialist government investment? Where's that invisible hand, Mr. Smith? I gotta make a bumper sticker. Where's the invisible hand, Mr. Smith? Where is it? Because it turns out capitalism works pretty well for the healthy and the strong, but not so much for the infirm and the dying, which, if you ask me, as a fundamental, that's the problem in our society. We have ordained greed as good. We have determined that if the market doesn't like it, then it must be worthless. And as I am seeing firsthand, my friends, life and death decisions for humans are based on actuarial tables. They're based on spending charts, based on fiscal risk assessments. That's the world we all refer to as the greatest country in the history of people. Doesn't that seem odd at all? All right, bottom line again. This is a convoluted matter, and it has a lot of sides to it. And when we're faced with these types of things, we have to do, or at least we have to go back to what we as a nation, as a state, as a people, what we value. We've all agreed that living in America means that we won't impose one way of life over another unless it's causing undue harm, as so determined by our codes and our laws. And our codes and our laws, they address persons, individuals. Remember, an embryo can turn into more than one person. Twins, triplets, and so on, right? It's pretty tough to then call a single embryo a person, isn't it? Because it might not be a single person. It might become 2 or 3 people. Okay. Let me try to explain the 14-day rule. First, really good stuff online. If you go to YouTube and just put on 14-day rule or put on primitive streak, there's some really great lectures and stuff that will explain this stuff much better than I can. But I'll give it my best shot. But it's a fascinating concept, and it goes a little something like this. All right, so I mentioned the blastocyst in another submission to my vlog here earlier, right? And the blastocyst is part of the process. It's a stage of the embryonic development, right? So when the cells connect, they turn into a zygote, and the zygote then splits up into 2 and then 4 and then 8 cells, and the cell, basically the developing embryo starts to travel down what's called the fallopian tube. Great word, fallopian. And it continues to, get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger with more cell division, right? And at some point, that thing gets into this, beautiful, almost embryo, but it's not quite there yet. It's got, the cells are getting bigger and bigger, and the cells that are closer to the center of this developing embryo are then some sort of a transformation starts to occur with them, and they in this world are referred to as the inner cell mass, right? So the inner cell mass kind of coagulates on one side of the inside of that embryo, right? So the outer cells kind of become like the placenta or the umbilical cord, if you will, that will hold the actual the child that's developing. So the inner mass, the inner cell mass, is actually what becomes us, becomes the human being, right? So eventually, after that mass coagulates on one side of it, the blastocyst now actually gets put into the uterine wall. The timing is like perfect. I mean, it's anybody who doesn't think there's a design going on there is anyway. So. And once it gets inside, then the inner cell mass start to flatten, and they start to develop what they call the germ layers, right? The ectoderm and the mesoderm and the derms, right? Basically, the top level becomes the skin, and then the center level is the organs, and then the bottom derm is the bone structure. So it's basically the beginnings of an actual body is starting to form, but not quite yet, because that all takes 14 days, right? For all of that, what I just talked about to take. And then at the end of the 14th day, the darndest little thing happens. On that flat disc that I was saying that's inside what is now the embryo, that the flat disc there's on the top derm, on the top level, there's a little indentation that suddenly is created, and they call that the primitive node, right? And it's because the cells that are on that particular level are, for some reason, starting to fall into the lower level cells, right? The special cells start to, they start going, maybe we don't have to stay here at this level here. Hey, look, there's another level down there. And they start looking into other levels, right? And so that deepening starts to then create this, literally, a groove that runs right along from the one side of the embryo right towards the middle. And ladies and gentlemen, that is our butt. Not just our butt, our reproductive system, our excrementing system. Words. It's that we all start with the butt, right? And as that streak develops, that basically becomes the axis of our body, right? It becomes our legs, and you can actually see it when the streak, they call it the primitive streak, and when it starts to go up the cell, when it gets to the middle of the cell, it drops a little bit into the lower, I want to call it the ectoderm again. I'm sorry, I'm not a biologist, but the level with the bones, those cells, the streak suddenly stops and it drops, and then suddenly your backbone starts to get developed, and it goes up to the gorgeous brain and the mouth and all that goodness. So, what I'm finding to make the most sense, and incidentally, seems like this is the stance of most scientists across the planet, even those that call themselves atheists, will say, you know what? We will no longer experiment with embryonic cells after day 14, because they can. They totally can. Actually, my understanding is quite recently they've been able to demonstrate that an embryo can live ex vivo outside the body for more than 14 days, and I think they've even been able to say it goes for 16, 17 days. They've been able to demonstrate that the energy contained in the development process of the embryo can continue, if you just project it, but they won't allow it to continue as a bioethically for some whatever. It's even the most secular of scientists tend to adhere to this thing. Now, there are lots of exceptions. There are nations on the planet that will go way beyond the stem cell research. They'll try to extract stem cells. I don't want to say this. This is a little too gross. So, but believe me, there are countries all over the planet that will go way past that 14-day embryonic stage. So that's what the 14-day rule is. And to me, it seems like it meets the needs of all sides, right? The religious, the believers who, think that there's something wrong with people controlling their own evolutionary process, I contend that that's already happened, folks. That ship has sailed. Because, we've already evolved from Homo sapien, right? I mean, with the advent of these, network technologies and, we're, a lot of interesting thinkers across the country and across the world will suggest to you that we have evolved past Homo sapien. Now we're a new thing. We're able to actually control our own destiny. Some people use terms like Homo evolutus. I'm sure there's a lot of interesting talk online. Reddit. You ever gotten stuck in Reddit for a couple days? Anyway, so why am I making a big deal out of all this stuff? Who cares, dude? What do you know from stem cells and stuff? So because I don't know if you heard, but my wife, she has Lou Gehrig's disease, right? It's a neurodegenerative disease. And what this neurodegenerative disease does is it just destroys your neurons so that, the brain sends signals, but the body won't listen, don't work, right? But the damnedest thing happens, and we know it, it's happening, we're seeing it, there is empirical evidence, it's not some quackery, you can see it, it's really happening. You take the good stem cells and then you put it back inside and the damnedest things happen. And I'm not talking about just neurodegenerative stuff, folks. It happens with the heart. It happens with the liver. You have a broken part of the brain. Something is, you had an epileptic seizure or some stroke happened and you lost part of your brain and now you can't remember the number 9 for some odd reason. Folks, I'm trying to be a little light here, but, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful because that stuff is pretty devastating too. It's not, right? It's not all about ALS. No, this is about getting our heads together and saying, why? God wouldn't want the suffering of man. Why would God want us to, why would God say, hey, you can fix yourself. Here's how you fix yourself. But don't. Why would that happen? What God does that? No God does that. I don't do that. My father wouldn't do that. Anybody who loves doesn't do that. It's because of misinformation, lack of understanding of what's happening. There are no children. There are no fetuses we don't touch anything. We don't do anything. But we have to be able to fund the use of at least embryonic stem cells. And why not, I think they're called zygotic stem cells. Why not use totipotent stem cells? Okay, I can see there's some bioethical lines there, right? Okay. Because really the only reason you would need totipotent stem cells would be if you want to, create life, right? Like literally make a man, a person, you know what I'm saying? Because you don't need all you get out of that is the placenta cells and the umbilical cord cells. But pluripotent cells in embryos without ever even seeing the semblance of anything that would come remotely close to being called a person. And the moment it does, right, that 15-day rule, right, it's not a slippery slope. It happens, by the 14th day, the end of it starts. When that groove starts to get built, when we can see, look, the cell, yes, the mechanics of everything is accurate. All of the mitochondria and the blah, 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 all the stuff works. And the cell is able to initiate the transformation into a human being. Okay, let's stop. Now look, a lot of folks would say, no, bro, that's not a human being. That's still a cell. It doesn't think, it doesn't breathe. Okay, all right, fine. But how about we do a little compromise here, right? Let's be educated people. Let's do what's right for people, because when we let this kind of fervor take over conversations, life and death decisions can't be based on somebody's opinion, right? So, politics, religion, and money are the things that are preventing my wife from being able to get the stem cell treatments that she desperately needs right here in California. No, instead, I have to sell my home, cash in my investments, beg people for money, so that I can take her to Mexico and have the treatment provided there. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure, I've heard, especially the dental treatment apparently is incredible in Mexico, but what? In the research capital of the planet, in the richest society ever, we're gonna let dogma do this to us? And you can't wait to make these decisions. You can't say, well, we're okay for now, so we don't really need to deal with the philosophy. We don't really need to deal with the morality. We don't really need to deal with, uncomfortableness. No, because, everything's okay here. Because when it happens to you, when your wife gets ALS, it's too late to take a stance. Yeah, so I might be preaching, but where was I? How much money how much did I give to Parkinson's? How much of a fight that I put up for Alzheimer's? No, it's not in my world. It's not going to happen to me. So